North Carolina has a distinguished history of sacrifice during wartime that was particularly true during the Vietnam War. More than 200,000 Tar Heels answered the call of their country and sacrificially served in Southeast Asia. 1,600 North Carolinians paid the ultimate price, and hundreds more have died in succeeding years of Parkinson's disease, PTSD, cancer, suicide, and other lingering effects of their service. Many of the men and women who returned to the Old North State were not greeted as heroes. Some were called baby killers. Some of these brave warriors were spit upon. Others learned that the uniform they wore so bravely was an emblem of shame to others. But now is their time. A time when all Americans can pause and honor those men and women who did everything that their country asked of them. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built on the promise that we would never forget our sons and daughters who fought in Vietnam, and that we would never forget how many were badly treated when they returned home. One of them was Dan Bullock of Goldsboro. The secret he carried to the grave is no longer a secret.
Dan Bullock was born in Goldsboro, but at the age of 11 moved to Brooklyn, New York, when his mother died. 3 years later, he visited his relatives in North Carolina wearing his United States Marine uniform. He was only 14 years old. He had forged his birth certificate, adding 4 more years to his age. His father allowed the forgery because he knew how Dan wanted to join so badly. Fellow Marines say what Bullock did at Parris Island was impossible. Boot camp was the hardest thing they ever did. Bullock did it as a boy. But when he got to Vietnam, he was nothing special. Combat veterans, the fighters going out on patrol, were always leery about the new recruits. The new guys didn't know the ropes and could get everyone killed. And the veterans were particularly leery of Bullock. There was something different about him. They knew he was keeping a secret, but never guessed that the muscular 160-pound Marine should have been a freshman in high school. On June the 7th, 1969, he switched jobs with another Marine, taking a guard duty assignment on the camp perimeter. Guard duty was usually light duty at the combat base, but on this night, the Viet Cong attacked. A satchel bomb was tossed into the bunker where Bullock and 3 other soldiers were on guard duty. The fighting was fierce, and the enemy advanced, and then they paused to riddle the bodies of Bullock and his companions with rifle fire. No one at the camp knew Bullock's secret until the national news media came asking about the 15-year-old Marine that had been killed. Suddenly, everything they knew about Bullock made sense. Bullock was buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Goldsboro. His grave remained unmarked for 31 years, twice as long as he lived. In 2000, a talk show host, Sally Jesse Raphael, moved by the story of Dan Bullock, donated a headstone. A caravan of motorcycles with hundreds of riders escorted the headstone from New York to Goldsboro, and a memorial service was held with full military honors. Today, he is not forgotten. Most days, his tombstone is littered with coins from military personnel who have come to pay their respects. A North Carolina highway historical marker telling his story was erected in Goldsboro on Memorial Day in 2017. Dan Bullock was the youngest American to serve and die in Vietnam. Now everyone knows Bullock's secret.
There is a special pain not knowing your loved one's fate. Air Force Captain Glenn Cook's parents never accepted that he had perished in Vietnam.
Glenn Cook seemed to be the perfect military man. Why, when a friend once teased him about the hours he spent polishing his shoe, Glenn replied that polished shoes were the mark of a well-dressed man. He was an outstanding student at Garinger High in Charlotte and was even president of the engineering club. He was a natural fit at the Citadel, where he was the ideal cadet. Upon receiving his degree in civil engineering, Glenn, or Cookie as he was called, was commissioned as an Air Force second lieutenant. And after a year in flight school, he headed to Vietnam as a forward air controller. On October 21st, 1969, Cookie took off in a small Cessna Skymaster along with observer Major John Espenschied. Their mission was to fly low and slow over the jungles of South Vietnam, spot North Vietnamese troops, and then call in the airstrikes. A forward air controller was one of the most hazardous jobs in the war, and the unarmed and unarmored plane was an easy target for ground fire. His radio suddenly went silent as he was calling in airstrikes. The U.S. Air Force searched for a week looking for the wreckage, but the triple canopied foliage swallowed the flyer and made it impossible to see the wreckage. Frank and Eleanor Cook died believing their son would one day return from Vietnam. When he was first reported as missing in action, they held no funeral, no memorial service, and wrote no obituary. They never stopped believing that one day he would return home to them, his wife, to the child whom he'd never seen. 19 years after the Cessna's disappearance, Vietnamese authorities reported they had found a crash site along with the remains of an American soldier. The plane was indeed a Skymaster, but the remains were of Espenschied, and there was no trace of Cook. On May 31st, 2015, a graveside memorial service with full military honors was held at the Sunset Memorial Gardens in Mint Hill, North Carolina. An Air Force Honor Guard, a U.S. Marine Honor Guard, and a bugler all paid their respect 46 years after Cook's final mission. Though he did not return in body, Captain Glenn R. Cook did return to Charlotte in spirit.
Serving the nation in war was a tradition in Freddie Martin's family. His grandfather established that freedom was worth fighting for. Freddie continued the tradition.
Frederick Leon Martin was born on Pembroke Road in a house that was built by his grandfather in New Bern, North Carolina. Freddie, also known as Little Luke, was a terrific athlete, and at 6'5", 190 pounds, he was a high school track star. Freddie was a remarkable young man, known for his sense of humor and his enjoyment of life. Yet rather than accept a scholarship to college, he answered the call of duty and enlisted in the Army, feeling that he owed his service to his country. Freddie Martin was born into a family that understood that service. Frederick's grandfather, Luke Martin Sr., was born enslaved in 1837 near Plymouth, North Carolina. Luke Sr. ran away from the plantation where he had been enslaved. He crossed 2 swamps and swam 3 rivers in order to get to New Bern. New Bern had been recently liberated, and in January of 1863, it became a place where formerly enslaved blacks were now free. Upon his arrival, he joined the Color Brigade, fighting for the Union Army. Luke fought bravely in the Siege of Charleston and in the Battle of Olustee, where he was wounded. After the war, he returned to New Bern, where he built a house on Pembroke Road, the same house where his grandson Freddie was born. Now it was his turn to serve, and the Army sent young Freddie to serve in Vietnam. After arriving, he had written a letter to a friend saying, "Vietnam is no joke. Charlie is tough. A week later, he stepped on a landmine and was killed. Freddie and his grandfather Luke Sr. are buried at the National Cemetery here in New Bern, just a few feet apart.
Coach Native Air Force Lieutenant Colonel William S. Willis was killed on April 4, 1975, as he participated in one of the most tragic stories of the Vietnam War. As the United States was leaving South Vietnam, thousands of people were trying to flee the country. President Gerald R. Ford authorized the evacuation of several thousand Vietnamese orphans in what was going to be called Operation Baby Lift. To speed the evacuation of orphans, the first group would exit on a massive C-5A Galaxy, the largest plane in the world at that time. And Willis, an Air Force operations manager, was summoned by the base commander to get the plane in the air as quickly as possible. So the plane flew to Saigon, and there 150 babies were placed in the 75 seats packed child, pillow, child in the passenger compartment located upstairs in the plane. At least 120 children and 53 civilians were placed in the cargo area in the lower level. 12 minutes into the flight and at 23,000 feet, latches holding the rear cargo ramp failed, and the rear ramp and the pressure doors blew out, severing control lines to the tail and destroying hydraulic systems and causing a rapid decompression. Willis was in the cockpit at the time when the catastrophe happened. He told the pilot he was going to the cargo area to help amid the chaos. Survivors remembered Willis and the medical staff remaining calm and professional as they treated the injured and calmed the wounded. The pilot, Captain Dennis Traynor, did a heroic job of controlling and turning the plane in an attempt to get it back to Saigon. The irreparably damaged plane made it almost all the way back, but finally went down within a couple of miles of the Tan Son Nhut airfield. Willis was an experienced pilot, and he knew the plane would make a crash landing and that he would be safer upstairs. But he stayed in the cargo area because he was needed there. The plane broke into 4 pieces. The cargo compartment was crushed and utterly destroyed. Only 8 people in the cargo area survived. Remembering Lieutenant Colonel William S. Willis, who lost his life in one of the final tragic chapters of the Vietnam War.
The vast majority of the 2.5 million Americans who served in Vietnam returned home and were able to move on with their lives. But all who served in Southeast Asia bore some scars from their time of service, and many of the men and women had their lives defined by that time of service. Butch Davenport was one of those. The running joke in our neck of the woods is the path to success travels alongside music, athletics, or the military. Butch decided his best chance to become a medical doctor was through the military. Soon after graduating from Civil Webster High in 1966, he became a corpsman and was assigned to the U.S. Marines 3rd Division in Vietnam. He wrote home that being a corpsman in Vietnam was like living in hell. He despaired at the lives of the men that he could not save. Casualties were extensive. He volunteered to return because he thought he was needed. It was during his second tour that the helicopter that he was flying in was shot down in Cambodia. Officially, there were no U.S. troops in Cambodia, certainly no U.S. Marines and their corpsmen. There could be no official rescue attempt. His family only knew he was missing. Eventually, one quick, quiet attempt was made to bring the men home. Miraculously, Davenport and the 7 Marines had evaded capture and had lived off the land for 79 days. Butch was alive but changed. He received a Purple Heart for his injuries, but But there was no award for the most severe injuries because they were invisible. The contaminated water he drank in the Cambodian jungle permanently damaged his kidneys. He developed tumors throughout his body, the result of exposure to Agent Orange. But the most horrid injury was post-traumatic stress. He went from being the guy that pulled a local child with polio around the neighborhood in a wagon to someone who was withdrawn, quiet, worried, and prone to outbursts of anger. He survived Vietnam, but he surrendered his life for his country.
Many nurses, fresh out of school, were prepared to give up the comforts of home to offer aid and solace to injured American warriors 8,000 miles from home. They quickly adjusted to the carnage of war and untold suffering by our young soldiers. They learned to hold the hands of dying young men who called out to their mothers and pleaded for their nurse to stay by their side so they would not die alone. Many of these Vietnam nurses were not prepared for the toll that the war would take on them physically and emotionally. The smell of diesel fuel and blood, the chaos that became an organized chaos. The sound of the blade bringing in more casualties. All these things and more would linger in their minds for years. The images, unsummoned, return to them even now. Most of the young women left their homes convinced that they could save them all. Many of those young women returned old beyond their years.
Despite the hardships, many Vietnam nurses say it was the greatest year of their life, and the worst. Nurses were often shocked when they arrived in Vietnam. The temperature could reach 105 degrees in the hospitals. Mortar and rocket attacks were common. During times of mass casualties, nurses worked 16 to 24-hour shifts, constantly making life and death decisions.
Ruth Graham purchased a retirement home near Fort Bragg in Fayetteville, North Carolina in 1967. She was retiring from the U.S. Army after serving her country for over 25 years on 4 continents and in 2 wars. She entered the Army in March 1942 and served in Italy during World War II and in Camp Yokohama, Osaka, in Japan during the Korean War. She was the head nurse in Ethiopia where she worked with polio victims, and she became the medical surgery supervisor at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. No one was surprised when she postponed her retirement and accepted the Army's offer to re-enlist as lieutenant colonel and become the chief nurse of the 91st Evacuation Hospital in Tuy Hoa, Vietnam. She felt her country needed her, and she cared. Graham, 52 years old, was known for keeping a tight rein on her nurses and for devotion to her patients and the people of South Vietnam. She received the Legion of Merit for her service during the Tet Offensive, when she often worked 40-hour shifts. She is one of 8 nurses listed on the Vietnam Memorial Wall.
Hello, I'm Scotty McCreery, and I'm from Garner, North Carolina. Thousands of people went to our Lake Benson Park for my homecoming visit when I was on American Idol. Thousands more are expected at the park for a different kind of celebration when The Wall That Heals visits. We will honor our Vietnam veterans, including the 8 community men killed in Vietnam. Each is remembered at the Garner Veterans Memorial, the centerpiece of our park. Each of those men's names is engraved on the wall. One of them is Willard Harold Till, Jr., president of the Garner High School Bible Club, and volunteered for the U.S. Marines because men were dying in Vietnam and he wanted to be there to pray for them. Harold had told one of his best friends that he believed he would die in Vietnam. But Harold said he was fine with dying if his passing would save the life of another. His patrol was ambushed on a hillside by an entrenched North Vietnamese force. The Marines were pinned down on the open hillside. They could neither advance nor retreat. A hand grenade exploded next to Harold, mangling his leg. All the Marines thought they were going to die that day, until Harold said, "When I stand up, you run." Harold struggled to his feet, firing his M60 machine gun from the hip, and began to limp up the hill. His friends scampered to safety as Harold fearlessly advanced.
Just like in the movies, he stood up with that machine gun and he just laid on that trigger. And we all made it. We all made it into the clearing. And as we look back, the second that his last round went out, they opened up the machine gun. They literally almost shot his head off. That was the bravest I seen over there.
Willard Harold Till Jr. received the Silver Star for his actions that day.
The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund has created a 3/4 scale replica of the memorial that travels the United States to bring the memorial to every corner of the country. The Wall That Heals helps our veterans sort out their feelings about their time of serving and gives all Americans the opportunity to learn of the sacrifices of our brave warriors.
The Wall That Heals stretches almost 400 feet in length and is about 8 feet at its tallest point. The wall journeys to more than 35 communities each year. It travels with its own mobile education center and explains the complexities of a war fought 50 years ago. The name of each of the more than 58,000 American men and women who perished in Vietnam is engraved in granite. Their names will not fade away. Each name represents a grieving home. Collectively, the names represent a grieving nation.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on.
The Wall That Heals is a sacred place of healing and reverence. At the base of the Wall That Heals, all people find acceptance and healing. Millions of tears water the grass beneath the traveling wall. The Wall That Heals gives permission to hundreds of thousands of visitors to pay their respects to our courageous men and women. A place to mourn, a place to cry, a place to set stoicism aside for a moment and reflect on service and sacrifice. 1,600 North Carolinians who made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country are remembered on the wall. It is a place to marvel at a country that produces ordinary citizens willing to make extraordinary sacrifices in the name of freedom.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
It's very special. It gives the service members who can't make it to the wall in Washington, D.C. a chance to see the memorial in their hometown, and to go up and to either, a lot of them will trace the names of the servicemen and women that they were with that are on the wall. To be there with all the veterans was just quite an honor, and it's very special that we honored all the 58,000 plus soldiers that are on the wall. It's a place of honor There's so many young men and women that whose lives were lost in a very, very tough environment in Vietnam. A lot of veterans suffer from post-traumatic stress, and that may affect them by being at the wall. But it's also called the wall that heals. So that's very important too, that there is a healing process there when they go and talk to other veterans. And that helps, I think, to reduce some of the PTSD that they're experiencing. I remember the days when we were not appreciated during Vietnam. It was a very long war, and there was protests. And that's what makes America great, where we're able to state our feelings in a free republic like we have here.
The Vietnam Veterans Memorial also has established an in-memory program. If your loved one survived a tour in Vietnam but has now died, the in-memory program would like to honor him or her. Please contact the number on your screen so that your loved one can be honored. We would like to fulfill our promise of never forgetting, always honoring.
Second Marine Aircraft Wing Band would like to dedicate Sound Off March, composed by John Philip Sousa, to you. With its flourishing woodwind lines and explosive brass, we feel like this march really captures musically the essence of the intensity of armed conflict, but also the unrelenting valor and American spirit exhibited by our service members.